So the first thing we want to talk about is a little bit of the energy landscape. Electricity has actually changed a shocking amount, and then we're going to talk to Tim a little bit about what's changed from a regulatory standpoint at different levels of the government. So first, Tim, energy consumption per capita has effectively been flat since like 1990, and that is starting to change pretty dramatically. And in fact, the electric grid in general has some quite wild changes right now. Can you just take us through like what's changing and why?
Sure, yeah. Well, fortunately, there is no politics in energy, so we don't have to worry about politicization in this area. It's true that for a long time, for decades, the load was essentially flat. There were no significant increases in demand on the electric system, and what there was largely addressed through increasing efficiencies, and so there was not a lot of new generation being built, and we're seeing power plants aging out, and as their decisions are being made about replacing that generation, there was, increased interest in replacing those with renewables, and this is happening not just in Michigan or in the U.S. but around the world, so there's significant new renewables that were coming in onto the system, and retirement of typically coal-fired plants, some natural gas-fired plants. It depends on where you're living. In Michigan, we're not a coal-producing state, so all of our coal is imported. It was really becoming less and less economic to operate those plants, so the utilities had decided to phase those out, and they were being replaced with largely renewables, some gas-fired generation, but largely renewables. Now that's changed recently. We've seen AI. I mean, anyone who hasn't lived under a rock lately has been hearing about data centers and AI and some of these issues that are driving enormous potential increases in demand. And we can talk a bit about how much of that is expected to really show up, but the numbers are fairly staggering. And then there's other factors. There's electrification, there's EVs, building of battery plants. The plants to build the batteries that go in the EVs are tremendous energy users, almost on the scale of a data center. So there's all this new load that's all of a sudden projected. Some of it has started to come onto the grid, some of it's projected to come onto the grid.
Yeah, you can see here, I mean, it's pretty significant when you're just kind of prodding along and then all of a sudden, and I think you're right for stating, like, there's a lot of variability to this. The press releases for AI energy consumption, and I think the reality in 15 or 20 years, there's probably going to be a big delta there, and that's why you can see there's a lot of different projections here, but even the most conservative projection shows still a significant increase in electricity requirements. We have a couple more graphs here. Maybe, Tim, you can take us through around, I think we want to talk about this because a lot of people don't realize what the generation mix in the United States is right now. And so, I think a lot of people are surprised to hear 40% of all of our electricity generated is renewables or nuclear. So it's basically like no carbon generation.
Yeah. Yeah, the renewables have ramped up significantly, and wind and solar are generally the cheapest and the fastest generation resources to put on the grid. So they've been adding them pretty quickly. If we can go back a slide, that breakdown is pretty similar for Michigan as well. We've got a little bit less coal, a little more natural gas, a little more renewables here in Michigan, but largely those numbers are pretty similar as the national level. You may be aware the Palisades nuclear plant was scheduled for shutdown. That has been reversed. They're working on restarting that. Talking about adding some new, potentially adding new nuclear resources to the grid. It's a time of significant change in this layout of energy resources.
Yeah, speaking of change, when you go to the next slide, what's been fascinating to me is how much coal has dropped. And I think you're right, as much as it may show up in the news, the reality is the market drives a lot of this, and the reality is it's just not economic across the country. And so it's been fascinating to see, kind of peaked around, it looks like 2000, and it was nearly half of our entire electric generation is coal. And now we're down below 20%, which is it's a pretty precipitous drop.
Yeah. I mean, politics aside, at least in Michigan, the utilities are not going to maintain their coal plants. They're not economic. So you could replace them with natural gas. You can replace them with renewables. You can replace them with other things. But to try to keep a coal plant operating in Michigan, it's just expensive.
Awesome. Okay, so hopefully that helps set the table a little bit on the electric grid. Let's talk about what is the federal government doing when it comes to energy policy that would be relevant to the attendees here, Tim?
Well, the current administration made significant changes in the tax incentives and for renewable energy. So, I mean, here in Michigan, for instance, we had seen a lot of interest from developers from around the country coming to Michigan and putting in new projects in Michigan. There are still a lot of new projects coming in, but the interest in ones that were not already underway has pretty well dried up. That's not true on the battery storage side, where the incentives remain. So we're still seeing a lot of interest in battery storage, and those projects are important for integrating renewables into the grid successfully.
Yeah, and I think it'll be interesting. I have a little bit of contrarian take here, but I would argue that you may not find as much of a drop in penetration of wind. I think is just constrained by geography, right? All the good spots for wind, or many of the good spots for wind, have been developed, and so you're seeing wind grow at a slower pace. But the solar is just starting to ramp up the curve, and so I would argue, if you're looking for shovel-ready projects past 2027, when the incentives and subsidies run out, solar still seems to be likely the fastest technology, plus storage in many cases, to be deployed into the grid. Is that what you're seeing as well?
Yeah, they're going in. It is much faster. The people interested in putting in a natural gas plant, I mean, just obtaining the equipment that you need for a natural gas plant, the back order on that is years.
I've heard 2030 if you want a turbine.
Yeah.
And they're not manufacturing a lot of those in the U.S. anymore even.
Right.
You have to import them from Germany or Japan.
Yeah. So just getting, aside from the politics of it all, just getting that equipment in and getting it installed, and the timeline for doing that is long.
Yeah, so I think what I see more and more, and like what Tim is talking about, is the generation mix isn't necessarily going to change as much as presidents want to think they can change. The market is really driving a lot of this. What the unfortunate reality will be is if solar is still the most compelling new asset to deploy, but the subsidies for 30 to 50% off of it are gone, what you'll likely end up seeing is the cost for generation will go up 30 to 50%. And so that's, I think, what we're going to start to see in the marketplace. And again, we'll see this in the next couple slides too, which is power prices have been going up faster than inflation the last few years, and I would argue that trend will likely only continue.
Yeah, that's been driven, in Michigan at least, it's been driven largely by investment in the distribution system rather than the generation system. But there's going to need to be significant new increased spending on generation as well, so we're likely to see that accelerate.
Well said. Okay, so let's move to the state level, and maybe I'll just caveat this too. So most of Michigan operates in MISO, which is the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. It's a mouthful. It basically runs all the way from Michigan down to Louisiana, and it's effectively the people who run the electric grid in this middle part of the country. So, Tim, can you just talk us through what's happening in MISO and kind of what's happening in Michigan that's noteworthy?
Well, the two big holdups for getting new generation online is interconnection to the grid and siting those successfully. At least in Michigan, it's been a problem elsewhere. But I work in Michigan, so local zoning is controlled at the local level in Michigan. So when the legislature passed the law in 2023 to move siting for some of the large projects up to the Michigan Public Service Commission if they're unable to get siting approvals at the local township level. The siting approvals have been a bottleneck for a lot of these projects. The other bottleneck has been interconnection, and the interconnection queue at MISO to interconnect to the transmission grid, and the one at PJM as well, which covers Ohio and Ohio, Indiana, and then Pennsylvania and eastward, is those interconnection queues are very long. They're working on reforms to those. MISO has got a fast-track process in place for a certain number of projects. They've approved the first tranche of those, and they've now opened up a second tranche. The first tranche largely consisted of natural gas plants. We're expecting, I would expect that the second tranche will probably have more renewables in it. But I think that was, in part at least, a function of sort of the criteria they were looking for, which were kind of shovel-ready and a certain place already in the interconnection grid so that they could, an interconnection queue, so that it could quickly move through to be sited.
Got it. So it sounds like because of all these changes we talked about before, there's a lot more appetite at the interconnection area to speed up that permitting process, just because it was just dragging. And I'm guessing there's a lot of motivation across industrial and grid operators and utilities to have a faster interconnection process so that you can get new assets into the grid and help actually support.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, and part of the challenge that this raises, I think, for manufacturers is meeting sustainability goals, because as we see that grid mix, probably not tilting more toward renewables significantly in the short term. It will, I think, eventually in the long term, but maybe not in the short term. It might, that can raise challenges for meeting your sustainability goals if you're obtaining your electricity strictly through the local utility. There are voluntary green pricing programs that they offer. The utilities are having a challenge getting enough projects in the ground to satisfy the demand for those. And the state has changed the requirements for what qualifies as renewable energy in the state, which has actually made that slightly more difficult as well.
Well, yeah, and maybe while we're on that topic, and then we'll wrap up here, is Michigan passed a new renewable portfolio standard that's significantly more aggressive than the previous one. Can you just tell us, like, what's the high level, where are we trying to get, and what percentage of renewables are we trying to get to?
Yeah, we're trying to get, well, there's a renewable energy standard and then a clean energy standard. So ultimately, think of it probably as carbon-free resources. So there'll be nuclear, it'll be carbon sequestered natural gas, it'll be things like that. The challenge has been that in the course of that legislation, they also redefined what renewable energy credits would be available to meet those standards. And they essentially told the utilities in the state that they need to either have those resources being built in the state and be owned by them, or to be able to purchase the capacity that comes with the plant as well as the renewable energy credits. That's made it difficult because the capacity for all the existing plants is pretty well already committed.
Sure.
And so you're required, the intent, I think, was to try to drive new build, but because of the bottlenecks we talked about, getting those in place in time to meet the new standards is a challenge for the utilities and other suppliers. So we're seeing them applying for extensions of time to meet those requirements.
Yeah, there's a lot of tension between, like, utilities. Usually their job is to offer reliable, clean, and cost-effective, and those are kind of all right now in tension, and that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Okay, so final question for you. From the Michigan standpoint, there is some opportunities for procurement and doing renewables and buying things. Can you just talk us through, like, what are some of the possibilities here?
The utilities do have some tariffs that they're able to be a little more creative with. I mean, we talked about the voluntary green pricing program. There's some large energy user tariffs that you can take advantage of. There's other behind-the-meter opportunities here in Michigan. Michigan is a little bit unique in this respect. I've been told I shouldn't call it a regulatory loophole, but it really kind of is. You can build your own generation or have your own generation built for you by a third party that knows what they're doing, and either on site or on an adjoining site, and sell the power to you. That is not then considered a regulated sale. Doesn't make anybody a utility. It's considered self-generation, behind the meter, self-supply in the state. So in other states, they limit your ability to do that. In Michigan, it's a statutory right. So there are a few folks that have taken advantage of that around the state, and I'm hearing a lot of interest in people doing it. As rates increase, that becomes economically more and more appealing.
And I can tell you, Foresight is actually in the middle of 2 different contracts with large clients with big industrial loads here in Michigan for a behind-the-meter power purchase agreement like Tim is talking about. So this is really compelling if you're interested in any of this regarding, like, on-site solar or any other energy stuff. Don't hesitate to reach out. But Tim, thank you so much for your time here.
Sure, happy to.